get into our study. We're in Genesis chapter 44, and as you turn there, I'll remind you about an event that's happening in Buena Park this very night. It is the conclusion of something called Silverado Days. This is not a commercial, it's an introduction. Silverado Days, it's the 63rd annual carnival-ish sort of thing that's been housed over just north up the road. If you see a little more traffic on Stanton or Beach, and some of that is due to Knott's Berry Farm, and some of it's due to Silverado Days. Silverado. Interesting name, isn't it? Makes you think of pickup trucks. Makes you think of Western movies. And maybe it makes you think of a place nearby in Orange County where they used to do mining. It's not really a Spanish word. It's a Spanglish word. Takes the English word silver and adds auto to it, like El Dorado, which is the golden one. Silverado is a made-up Spanish word. It's supposed to mean the silver one. It was named after, because they were mining and digging out silver. Now, why am I mentioning all this? The story we're looking at this evening in Genesis 44 mentions silver again and again. In fact, it's been mentioned a number of times in the story that Joseph has with his brothers. You could almost call these series of stories stretched out over these years the Silverado Days, because it began by Joseph being sold into slavery for 20 pieces of silver. And it's going to end by Joseph testing his brothers over a cup made out of silver. And we'll find out what everybody is made of by the time it's all done. Joseph has some inside knowledge that his brothers don't have. His knowledge has featured prominently in the story, but there's still something he doesn't know. What he doesn't know for certain is whether his brothers have changed. And he's going to find out. He has set up a test. In this chapter, the story of the conflict between him and his brothers is climbing towards its climax. And the steps up to the top are paved with irony and maybe a little bit of silver. So let's take a look at the chart just to overview what's happening. We are in what we could call the third audience that the brothers have with Joseph. This is chapters 44 and 45. And tonight we're looking at this final test that Joseph makes of his brothers. This test breaks up into two parts. There's the brothers' departure is reversed. They're about to leave. They're done with their second visit. They think this will be their last. But Joseph has a plan. And then the second half of this is in chapter 40, verses 14 to 34, where Joseph confronts his brothers to really see what it is that they are made of. Let's come back over to that first half, the brothers' departure reversed, and we'll see in verses 1 to 3 over on the left side of your chart, the final test is prepared. The silver cup is staged in Benjamin's sack. Joseph gives instructions to his steward to do this in verses 1 and 2. So Genesis 44, verse 1, then he commanded his house steward, saying, fill the men's sacks with food, as much as they can carry, and put each man's money, literally silver, in the mouth of his sack. Put my cup, the silver cup, in the mouth of the sack of the youngest, and his money for the grain. And he did as Joseph told him. Another test is being set up. The first test was back in chapter 42 when they bought grain during the famine, and Joseph had their money put back in their bags. And the test apparently is to see when they come back, which they inevitably will have to come back, will they be honest about what they discovered? And Joseph was also finding information about whether his closest brother, Benjamin, was still alive, or had they done dirty to him like they had done to him so many years before. And he was trying to find out about his father as well. Well, now they've come back the second time, and he knows of a certain, it sounds like his brother's still alive and his father's still alive, but he's still not sure whether they can be trusted. To determine whether they can be trusted, they need to be tested. So Joseph gives these instructions. He tells them, put their money back just like it happened before, and put my silver cup in it. This word cup is actually an Egyptian word, and this is an image of an ancient Egyptian silver cup that belonged to one of the pharaohs. Very costly. Silver was especially prized in ancient Egypt because it cannot be mined there. They have gold on supplies in the ground, but they did not have silver. So it had perhaps a higher value within ancient Egypt. Silver money, silver cup. And, well, we're going to see what these men are made of. Do you remember that it was pieces of silver in chapter 37, 20 pieces of silver that Joseph was sold for? And now silver is going to put them into a panic as well. So the servant completes the task. We read the end of verse 2. Come with me now to verse 3. As soon as it was light, the men were sent away, they with their donkeys. The servant had accomplished his mission and sent them off on their way. And now the conflict starts to arise in verses 4 through 6, where Joseph retrieves his brothers for interrogation. There are instructions given to the steward again in verses 4 and 5. They had just gone out of the city and were not far off when Joseph said to his house steward, "Up, follow the men. And when you overtake them, say to them, 'Why have you repaid evil for good? Is not this the one from which my Lord drinks, and which he indeed uses for divination? You have done wrong in doing this.'" Now, the steward knows that this is staged, but he's told here to be a good actor. And the steward completes this task. In verse 6, the note should say verse 6, so he overtook them and spoke these words to them. Now, before we move on to the next part of the conflict, perhaps you're wondering, what is this bit about Joseph using a cup for divination? We don't know if Joseph was actually using it that way or if he's just talking. He may very well be bluffing. It is true that in the ancient world, wealthy people, magicians and kings and the like, might use a silver chalice like what I showed you to try to divine the future. And they would do different sorts of things. They might fill it with wine and oil and see how the two intermingled. And if it, swarmed together this way, it meant one thing. And if it swarmed together another way, I don't know if oil swarms, but you get the idea, the way it mixes or doesn't mix. Odd little things. It would be roughly similar to the way people read tea leaves. They drink a bunch of tea and look out. It's all mystical sorts of nonsense. Nothing is ever explicitly said that Joseph was using the cup this way. He just told his servant, this is what you're supposed to tell them. The Old Testament law, centuries later, would outlaw this kind of thing. The only kind of divination that would be allowed later is the casting of lots, and the high priest to use the Urim and Thummim within his breastplate on occasion. So I think it's possible that Joseph is bluffing. Joseph has already showed them that he has inside knowledge, and they can't figure out how he knows it. Do you remember at the end of the previous chapter? They sit down at dinner with him, and the table is arranged, their seats are arranged from oldest to youngest. They never told him what the birth order was. Somehow he knows. So he has one up on them that way. Perhaps he's trying to perpetuate this mystical perception of him as having great inside knowledge. It's ironic that this cup that pagans might have used to divine things is going to reveal some things. The way they respond to this test is going to show way more than tea leaves or oil mixed with wine could ever show. So we come to verses 7 through 10, and the brothers protest their innocence. There's this, in verses 7 through 9, an emotional denial and defense and an oath of innocence. Verse 7, they said to him, "Why does my Lord speak such words as these? Far be it from your servants to do such a thing. Behold, the money which we found in the mouth of our sacks we have brought back to you from the land of Canaan. How then could we steal silver or gold from your Lord's house? With whomever of your servants it is found, let him die, and we also will be my Lord's slaves." That last verse I read is the language of an oath. If this is false, then death be upon us. This is an offer of death and slavery, and it is so ironic. Here's the first paving stone of irony. Back when Joseph was thrown into the pit, there were two options the brothers debated. Should we kill him or enslave him? And they opted for enslaving him. And now here are the brothers on the other end of things. Silver coins are involved again, and the options presented are death or slavery. Judah talking about, the brothers here talking about death might be an overstatement. It might be a rhetorical statement. Egyptian law would not have called for death in a case like this. Not even the Old Testament law would call for that. It might be somewhat like what their father had done back in chapter 31 when Jacob was leaving Laban's household, and Laban discovered that the household idols were missing. And Laban comes after us, what have you done? Why have you stolen these things? Then Jacob is incensed. How can you say I'd take, if it's found in anyone's son, let him die today. And of course, there they are in his wife's pack. My, how things come around. Well, in verse 10, the servant modifies the acceptance of this oath. He's not willing to go so far as has been stated here. So verse 10, so he said, now let it also be according to your words. He with whom it is found shall be my slave, and the rest of you shall be innocent. I'll take you up on your vow, but I'm going to adjust the terms. Whoever's got it, they will be enslaved. The rest of you will go. Now, the servant knows, and Joseph knows, where that cup is. It's in the bag of the youngest brother, the closest brother. And verse 11 and 13, we find the entanglement of Benjamin. The sacks are searched from the oldest to the youngest, beginning in verse 11. Then they hurried, each man lowered his sack to the ground, and each man opened his sack. They quickly do this. They want to prove their innocence and be done with this. Verse 12, he searched, beginning with the oldest and ending with the youngest, and the cup was found in Benjamin's sack. The discovery in Benjamin's sack. And they don't know how it got there. They assume there must be something they don't know what has happened. And the brothers lament and come back to Joseph in verse 13. Then they tore their clothes, and when each man loaded his donkey, they returned to the city. Joseph's servant knew what was going on, and he deliberately made this dramatic, didn't he? He started with the oldest, went down to the youngest. It seemed like it was all going to be cleared up until the last sack, and there it is. They rend their garments. Isn't it interesting throughout the Joseph stories how much clothes have featured into things? It started off by Joseph getting a fancy set of clothes, which were torn off of him, torn asunder, splattered with blood to look like he'd been killed by a wild animal. Joseph changes clothes a number of times throughout his stories, from being a high servant to a prisoner to finally being there with Pharaoh. Clothes, the last time clothes were torn in Genesis is when they went back to their dad and told him that Joseph is dead, and Jacob rent his garments. And the time before that was when Reuben thought he was dead, and he rent his garments. And now the brothers fear that Benjamin is as good as dead, and that when Jacob hears about it, he's going to die, and they rend their garments. Well, now we come to the second half of the chapter, beginning in verse 14. Joseph is going to interrogate his brothers. He confronts them, and the initial interrogation is in verses 14 through 17. In verse 14, they fall prostrate down before him. When Judah and his brothers came to Joseph's house, he was still there, and they fell to the ground before him. How many times have they done this now? Every time they see Joseph, they're falling down on their face, just like Joseph had dreamed many years before. They don't realize how they're fulfilling what God had foretold before. Joseph makes an incredulous query of them in verse 15. Joseph said to them, "What is this deed that you have done?" He makes a claim of divine insight next. "Do you not know that such a man as I can indeed practice divination?" Notice that Joseph doesn't mention the cup. "Don't you know that I have divine insight?" And you know what? He may not have practiced it the way that they thought he did, but he did have divine insight. God had told him things in his childhood. God helped him to interpret the dreams of the Pharaoh. Now, as Joseph is searching out things here, he's not using divination, he's using a test. But he definitely has the advantage over them. And the mystique that they have about him is just perpetuated. Don't forget, by the way, who Joseph's wife is. Joseph's wife is the daughter of one of the chief priests in Egypt. This persona that he's a man of Egyptian mystical power is very strong in his brother's eyes. So then, beginning in verse 16, Judah makes a confession of sin and the family's submission to slavery. Verse 16, "So Judah said, 'What can we say to my Lord? What can we speak? And how can we justify ourselves? God has found out the iniquity of your servants. Behold, we are my Lord's slaves, both we and the one in whose possession the cup has been found. You have found out our iniquity.'" It's ironic what Judah offers here as he's speaking. It's so ironic because Judah was the brother 20 years before who suggested selling Joseph into slavery. And now he offers himself and his brothers to become Joseph's slave, though he doesn't know who it is. The guilt that he confesses here is perhaps more than about the silver cup. They perhaps think that Benjamin lifted it. But apart from that, this guilt of the decades of guilt are finally coming to a head, and he admits that they've done wrong. Gone is all the conniving, all the plotting, all the lying, and it's a time to come clean. In verse 17, Joseph modifies this offer, just as the servant had modified the offer of the brothers of, kill the one who stole it and enslave the rest of us. So Joseph modifies it, and he says, well, we'll just enslave Benjamin only. Verse 17, "But he said, 'Far be it from me to do this. The man in whose possession the cup has been found, he shall be my slave. But as for you, go up in peace to your father.'" The test here reaches its climax. The reason Joseph has done all of this and come to this critical point, he wants to see, are his brothers going to ditch the younger brother and leave him to rot in Egyptian jail, in Egyptian servitude? Or are they going to rally together? Are they going to do to Benjamin what they did to him 20 years before? Or are they going to stick together? And what a difference. Things, in fact, have changed. And leading up to Joseph's realization of that, the last part of this chapter is Judah's request for substitution. Beginning in verse 18 through the end of the chapter, Judah will speak at great length. In fact, it is the longest speech in the book of Genesis. There's a contrite introduction that he makes in verse 18. "Then Judah approached him and said, 'O my Lord, may your servant please speak a word in my Lord's ears, and do not be angry with your servant, for you are equal to Pharaoh.'" Interestingly, the phrase at the beginning of verse 18, Judah approached him. It's the same language used when Abraham comes before God to intercede for the city of Sodom, if perhaps they might be spared. Judah is playing the role here of an intercessor. And then in verses 19 to 29 is a rehearsal of prior conversations that they had had with Joseph on their previous two audiences, conversations that they'd had with their father that Joseph did not know fully about. First, he talks about the explanations that they had made to Joseph about Benjamin's special status, beginning in verse 19. My Lord asked his servant, saying, have you a father or a brother? We said to my Lord, we have an old father and a little child of his old age. Now his brother is dead, so he alone is left of his mother, and his father loves him. Then you said to your servants, bring him down to me, that I may set my eyes on him. But we said to my Lord, the lad cannot leave his father, for if he should leave his father would die. You said to your servants, however, unless your youngest brother comes down with you, you will not see my face again. Joseph would be aware of all of this conversation. It had happened just a couple years before. But what follows after this now, the conversations that the brothers had with their dad, will be news to Joseph. So beginning in verse 24, through verse 29, he talks about the discussions they had with Jacob about protecting Benjamin. Verse 24, thus it came about when we went up to your servant, my father, we told him the words of my Lord. Our father said, go back, buy us a little food. We said, we cannot go down. If our youngest brother is with us, then we will go down, for we cannot see the man's face unless our youngest brother is with us. Your servant, my father, said to us, you know that my wife bore me 2 sons, and the one went out from me, which is an expression meaning he died. He went out from me, and I said, surely he is torn in pieces, and I've not seen him since. If you take this one also from me, and harm befalls me, you will bring my gray hair down to Sheol in sorrow. Judah now is going to express concern for his father and take personal responsibility, and how he's taken personal responsibility for Benjamin, beginning in verse 30. Now therefore, when I came to your servant, my father, and the lad is not with us, since his life is bound up in the lad's life, when he sees that the lad is not with us, he will die. Thus your servants will bring the gray hair of your servant, our father, down to Sheol in sorrow. For your servant became surety for the lad to my father, saying, if I do not bring him back to you, then let me bear the blame before my father forever. I have promised my father I will protect him. I know how precious he is to him. I have promised. It all comes to me. Implied in all this, in the most polite way possible, Judah is saying to Joseph, if you do this, you're going to kill our father. He says it in the most backdoor kind of way, the least accusatory way he can, but he's interceding. He's interceding not only for Benjamin, but perhaps even more so for Jacob. And that leads him then, in verses 33 to 34, to request to be made Benjamin's substitute as a slave to Joseph. Verse 33, now therefore, please, let your servant remain instead of the lad, a slave to my Lord, and let the lad go up with his brothers. For how shall I go up to my father if the lad is not with me, for fear that I see the evil that would overtake my father? This is an amazing reformation that we're seeing in Judah. He had his own story back in chapter, 36? 38. Now, I speak as a fool. I have to look and see which it is. 38. Joseph is introduced to us in 37. And then there's a little detour. And Judah has this sexual escapade, awful sort of thing. He was a corrupt man. But something's happened. He's changed. He's now not self-pleasing and self-satisfying. He's self-giving, willing to give up his freedom and the remainder of his life for the benefit of his father for the benefit of his brother. What a change. And Joseph sees it, and he doesn't need a divining cup to do it. The next chapter is one of the most emotional in all of Genesis, as Joseph will reveal his identity to his brothers. And the emotional turnaround there'll be as the climax of the stories are reached and things settle into a new normal. The text doesn't spell out for us what it was that took place in Judah to bring about all this change. But we know what the Bible teaches brings people about to change. It's grace. Grace forged into his life through adversity and trial and test. And there had been many tests of his character before that he had failed miserably. And now he's learning to pass them. Grace is changing him. Judah, vile Judah, is in a little way here in this story a Christ-like character. Praise God for grace. Judah is learning something that I learned years ago. It was as we conclude this evening, I was in college and there was a Bible conference, and there was a very famous preacher from Northern Ireland who was there, and I'd never met him before. I was introduced to him very briefly, and we shook hands, and then he looked at me, ramrodded his back, lifted his finger and said, "Souls are more than silver." If you need a translation, souls are more than silver. And he was thinking about the work of the gospel is more important than making money. That lesson is something that the brothers are learning. They sold their brother off for 20 pieces of silver. Joseph had ensnared his brother over pieces of silver. They're all coming to see the value of life, of being with one another is far more important than anything else. Life is the most precious thing. Family is one of the most precious things, and this family was uniquely chosen of God, raised up to become a conduit of blessing to the whole world. The family was to the point of breaking to smithereens. It looked like the plan of God was shattered and lost. But this long, drawn-out story is showing how God and his providence was bringing it about. And not only bringing it about, but bringing change to the hearts and lives of all those involved. Our Father, we thank you for the time we've had this evening to reflect on the great things that you've done in ages past. How you saved this family from certain death and destruction and disintegration. How you brought deliverance to them physically, and as we're beginning to see, a spiritual deliverance, an awareness of the things that are most important. Letting go of rivalry and strife and jealousy and self-seeking and a willingness to sacrifice for others. We're mindful, our God, that the greatest self-sacrifice of all is what you've done for us in your Son. He came to be the ultimate substitute, to pay for real crimes and to take away our guilt so that we might be part of this everlasting plan of blessing that you've introduced into the world. So, Lord, may we walk this week in the light of your love, in the light of your sacrifice, and may we emulate that self-sacrificial life to others round about us. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen.